Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of The Making of Us, Lived Religion in America, a subseries of the podcast Religion in the American Experience. In this subseries, we explore the role religion has played in the lives of everyday Americans, reminding us that while religion exerts a significant influence on the events and movements of the American project, religion's primary work and where it has the most influence is in the everyday lives of adherents. Today, Trey Ferguson of Homestead, Florida, joins to tell us his own religious history. Trey, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Trey, if you could, please tell us a little bit about yourself, though leaving out anything religious at this point, and we'll get to that later. Help our listeners get to know you a bit.
Most definitely. I am a child of the East Coast. I was born in New York, raised in Virginia, and I've spent the entirety of my adult life in Miami-Dade County. So I travel around a bunch there. That last part, being in Miami-Dade County, means that I am a tortured Miami Hurricanes fan. Spent the majority of the last 15 or so years wondering if the U was back. The answer is always no, by the way. Father of 3 wonderful children who keep me young, the husband of a wonderful woman who has been graced by the powers that be to put up with someone as unserious as me. And I talk about God in public a whole lot.
Okay, great. Great description of you. Thank you for that. Trey, can you describe for us who your parents and grandparents were religiously? What are their religious histories?
Yeah, my knowledge of my grandparents and their religious histories is somewhat limited by the fact that both of my grandfathers, my paternal grandfather, my maternal grandfather, passed before I was born. And so the knowledge there is pretty spotty. I can tell you that my father was an immigrant to the United States from Jamaica, and that his education on both sides of the gap there was largely provided by the Society of Friends, right? More commonly known as the Quakers. And so there was somewhat of an affinity for them on that side, which a lot of this is stuff I didn't come to know and realize until my adult life, because he was brought to the United States partially to complete his education from the Society of Friends, and didn't really resume a relationship with them until after my parents had separated. He had moved back to New York and was attending meetings again on a somewhat regular basis. My mother actually didn't come to any idea of faith or religious belonging in a serious fashion until she was an adult. And what that typically means is that your relationship with religion, like when you come to it as an adult, is taken a bit more seriously than people who are raised in that. Like, I don't want to say more seriously. That's probably the wrong way to phrase that. But the relationship with it is different in that it's something that you consciously came to on your own, as opposed to something that was assumed or inherited, right?
Sure. Yep.
And so both of my parents would be identified and would happily identify as Black people, right? Even my immigrant father. And so there's a degree to which, particularly here in the West, that experience is largely shaped by an assumed Christianity, right? Uh, it's the backdrop of a lot of the things that we do. And so that was there even with my grandparents, even if my maternal grandmother in particular wasn't an overtly religious person, but she's not going to deny the existence of God. In the language of Christianity. Like even speaking English is a tricky thing because English is a heavily Christian theological language when you think about it. Like even when we say the word God in English, what we're often envisioning is a Christian conception of God. My but my paternal grandmother on the other end, she lived to be 101 years old, and I'm not sure if she was this way her entire life or not. But for the majority of the time that I knew her, she was a very religious woman. She was a church going woman until she couldn't really get there regularly on her own. I recall being at her funeral, her homegoing service at the church that she called home for several decades, and the reverence that they held with her, or held for her rather, was something that'll sit with me for a long time. And so when we look at these various strains, right, like my mother coming to a serious sense of faith later in life, uh, my father having this connection with the Society of Friends. And mind you, I didn't know about this till later in life because he went to church with us, right? Like he was attending Black Baptist church with the rest of the family uh, for the entirety of the time that I knew him. Uh, and knowing that his mother was as committed to the church as she was, again, a Black Baptist church, those are the things that I've inherited uh, and kind of led me to where I am today, and somewhat of an openness to faith and an understanding of religion, not just as the things that we believe, but the things that we inherit and the signs and the stories that accompany those things.
Sure. That's super fascinating. So your dad has a Quaker background, right?
Yeah.
But it sounds, and we'll get into this later, but it sounds like he was active in a Black Baptist church when you knew him. And then your mother came to faith later. When she came to faith, was that before you came along, or was that
Yeah, that was
after?
before I came along. Yeah.
And what
My-
is there a story there? How did that happen with her? And how old was she? And what did it sort of do to her?
that is a fascinating question. And I won't claim to have that whole story. Now I need to go and interview my mother when I'm done with this because there's this adage that goes around that says that every man grows up to marry his own mother. I don't think it's all the way true. It is true for me because my wife shares a similar testimony in that she didn't really begin taking faith seriously until she was an adult. And even though I grew up in church and she didn't, she's the one who got me in the church because her curiosity led her back there. And I'd imagine my mother's story was somewhat similar. She wasn't unfamiliar with the idea of faith or church, uh, but I'm thinking that at some point a curiosity led her there. And there are times when people with that story discover a sense of community in these places, and then it becomes a central aspect of their life. And so by the time I came around, my mother loves telling the story of how I was born on a Wednesday and she brought me to church that Sunday, right? um, it wasn't too much waiting around with me. No, that's where I was supposed to be, according to my mother.
Right. Okay. Well, that story in and of itself tells a lot about the religious life of your mother
Yes.
when you were born. Okay. Thank you. So let's move into your young years, elementary school years. In what ways did religion influence you as you grew up during those years? You were in Richmond, I think, or New York, I don't remember, but where were you and what happened religiously in your home and to you?
Yeah, I spent the majority of my elementary years in Richmond, Virginia, and church was really central to what we did and who we were as a family. My mother was the leader of a Girl Scout troop at the church. She led a couple of different dance ministries at the church. Of course, we were there on Sundays. And so there's an interesting facet of how church works, where we think of church as a place that is centered around beliefs, which is true to a certain extent. But there are a lot of people who experience these as places of belonging, right? This is a community center. And so by the time we get to elementary years, I just assumed like my best friend was somebody who I met at church, right? And that wasn't the parameters of our friendship. We didn't only link up at church, but like, oh no, that this is where my people are. And
Right.
w- even though we had Sunday school and we learned memory verses and everything, the beliefs and aspects were only a part of what happened in this place. It was as much about the relationships and the formation and the development of us as people, right? The degree to which I was in Bible quiz competitions or whatever was as much about preparing me to speak in front of people and to experience the world as a confident person as it was any sort of catechism or anything, right? And so there's a degree to which we are not as concerned about the indoctrination that occurs in churches at that point as these are who your people are, right? These are the safe people. And there's, of course, a drawback to that because not everybody there is safe, right? But we're taught to believe that this is where you find belonging.
Okay. And what did the religious life for you look like at home? Like, give us a typical day. Uh, how did religion infiltrate the home and touch you at this age, during these ages?
That's a great question because, and this is something I even struggle with as an adult, to what extent like we practice like rituals and prayers and things of that nature. Because yeah, we said grace, we said bedtime prayers, but I know of other people who lived lives of devotion that made me wonder if I was doing enough at the time. I don't feel that way now, um, because I recognize that you pretty much get in where you fit in when it comes to practicing a religion in that way. But when I look back in my life, I realized that not all of our religious exercises were things that we would normally associate with Christianity. And I don't mean to say that, oh, we were pagans or anything of the sort, which I'm not even saying there's anything wrong with that. But an example of what I'm saying is every single year we celebrated Kwanzaa. And we had a caramel at the end, right? The feast where we would literally invite people. And most of those people that we invited were from our church, but they would come over, we would have a party and on New Year's Day. And it was a Kwanzaa celebration to the point where, oh, you think about a feast where you're inviting people, where there's a ritual performed, the lighting of candles, a reflection of things. That is a religious exercise. It's not associated with it's a non-sectarian holiday, but by every definition of the word religion, it is a religious exercise. It meets all of the things that are principles that are honored, right? Like Swahili words for them, but we're talking about purpose, collective work, and responsibility, and all of these different things that we're observing there. And that was as important to what we did as the Easter dinners and things that we had when we invited people. So when you ask about what religious life at the home was like, those things centered like, yes, we prayed over food and everything, but celebration and hospitality were critical markers of my childhood development. And they were a religious expression in a way that I didn't necessarily know the name at that time.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. You were young.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about those young years before we move into middle and high school and the religious life in your home and your religious life?
No, I think that about covers it.
Okay. Okay. So now, middle school, high school, how did religion influence you at those ages?
Yeah, so an interesting thing happened coming out of elementary school. My mother enrolled me at a private school, which was an Episcopalian school at the time, right? And so for the first time, like apart from when I was in kindergarten in New York, I was at Allen Christian School, which is an AME school, African Methodist Episcopal. But by the time I got to middle school, I was enrolled in a predominantly white school for the first time in my entire life. and it was an Episcopalian school where we did have to attend chapel a few times a week. Around Christmas time, we had to walk to an Episcopal school an Episcopal church up the street and go through services. And it was my introduction to the fact that there were some people who observed their relationship with nominally the same God that I believed in fundamentally different ways. It was my first time having to kneel down at a pew, my first time singing from a hymnal where the music didn't sound as soulful as I had come to know. And it's not that, like, I don't mean that as an insult. It just had a different quality to it. Mind you, we're reading from the same Bible and we're sharing the same stories, but the accent is different, right? The things that we're emphasizing is different. And that was always interesting to me because that's where I'm spending the majority of my days now. Like, I'm a student, but I'm still at the same Black churches, we're in the same community when I go home. And so I think middle school was probably a stage in which my understanding of religion was broadened because my parents were very intentional in raising me Black. Even if I decided to stop being a Christian, I would never forget that I was Black. But here I was sharing space with people who were not Black, who experienced the world in fundamentally different ways, yet used the same signs and symbols and stories for the most part to ascribe significance to the ultimate things. And so I think there was a level of discombobulation and disorientation and culture shock, really, going through that adjustment, which of course is compounded not just by me changing schools or whatever, but by being a pubescent boy, right? Middle school is awkward for everybody.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, did you talk about this with your parents, this religious discombobulation, or what you were learning and how you were filtering it through what was your previous and current also religious experience at your Black Baptist church? Was this a topic of discussion?
No, it wasn't. And a large part of that is because I'm speaking with the clarity that comes with age right now, in part. And then also around that age, you're a little too cool to be talking to your parents about a lot of stuff. And every kid in middle school knows everything, right? Like that was
Why
my
do you need to talk to your parents when you know everything?
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, for like at that point, I knew more than them, obviously, right? Like, this is me going through these things. And so I think there's also something interesting. It's a larger point about religion, because this is something I've come to learn that people of all sorts of different religions and expressions undergo heading into their teenage years, this almost rebellious phase. And I enter that, I don't want to tie that to religion, but um, for me at least, there wasn't a strong desire to hash these things out with my parents because even now, being a parent of teenagers and preteens, I heard them say out loud, like, oh, I want to make my own mistakes, right? And I guess intuitively at the time, I felt the same way. And so I think I have more conversations with my mother now about some of these things than I did when I was actually experiencing them and trying to sort them
Right.
out.
Right. So would you, in middle school, if someone were to ask you, are you religious? What would you answer? How would you answer that? Hey,
Oh, for
Trey, are you
sure.
religious?
Well, I probably I would have identified as a person of faith. I've had, until very recently, a complicated relationship with the word religion. And some of that is because of some of the seeds of evangelicalism that are thrown in, where we act as though Christianity is something other than religion. And of course, it can be, right? But the fact that religion is something to be shunned as opposed to the ways that societies and communities communicate important things, right? It's not something that's emphasized. So at the time, I probably wouldn't have identified as religious, just because I would have viewed religion as something that was bad or to run from, even as I affirmed myself as a man of faith.
Okay. Okay. So that was middle school, right?
Right.
What now? Let's move into high school. Anything change? More development of you as a religious person? What was going on in the home religiously? In those years? How did religion influence you?
High school was the first time that my mother asked me if I was going to church with her. it had never been a question at that point. It was get up, it's time to go to church. And one Sunday, she asked, she said, "Are you going to church?" And I thought it might have been a trick question. So I answered, as I said, no. And she said, okay. And she left and she went to church. And that was the first time where I began to make some choices. Now, mind you, I was still involved in different church activities and things of that nature, but it was the first time where I felt as though I had some sort of say in the matter. And so if you would have asked me at that time if I were a religious person, I almost certainly would have said no, for the simple fact that, like, one of my catchphrases became "Jesus is portable," right? Like, I still believe, but I don't need to do all of the things. Um, and part of that is just being a normal teenager, just wanting to do your own thing. And some of it might have been feeling fatigued because I spent a lot of time in church, right? And it wasn't just like I can go to church on Sunday and leave. Now, my mom liked to stay back and talk. So I was in church for hours on Sunday. Then I had to be there for rehearsals or practices or activities throughout the week sometimes. My mother was there probably at least 2 nights out of the week for various meetings or whatever. And so when an opportunity presented itself for me to do something else, I took it. Um, and that was my experience. But as I said, something I've come to learn later in life, a lot of people experience something similar in various traditions. Some religious expressions have that built in to the point where, like, you get to your teenage years, all right, we'll turn you loose for a little bit, and then you figure out if this is something that you really want to do, something that you want to commit to. And that's not how it was really presented to me. That was what I ended up experiencing. Right?
Right. Did and during high school, were you still going to an Episcopal school?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where I graduated from. Yeah.
Okay. And did Episcopalian teachings, beliefs, practices enter into your religious life, or were you strictly Black Baptist in your own mind? I mean,
Yeah, I would have still identified as a Baptist at the time. And that's no longer, I don't not identify as that, but not solely as that. And I remember there was one particular instance. I think it was actually still in the middle school years, but we had a guest speaker in chapel one morning. And it was the first time we had a Black person who wasn't an alumni of the school speaking there. And I believe that he was a Methodist minister. And he spoke with an excitement and a charisma that you don't often find in Episcopal settings. And I remember reflexively, I started clapping at something he said. And I looked around, as nobody else was doing it, and I forgot where I was. Like, I had forgotten where I was because he made me feel at home. And that's an example of how I didn't ever really feel like I fit in. And it's not to say like nobody made me feel uncomfortable or anything. It just never felt like home being in Episcopal like worship settings or Episcopal liturgical settings. And the whole time though, like even with that being the case, even with me being like, this is not who I am, this is not for me, I always found the beauty in it, right? I remember there were a few times where I had opportunities to put out the candles and after a chapel service, and I relish those opportunities because there's something beautiful about the rituals and everything. And so I guess to a degree, there were times where I appreciated the beauty, even as like, were it not for chapel services and me having to be there, I never would have sought that out. I still
Right.
haven't to this day, but I definitely appreciated some of what I was exposed to.
right. Now I've heard some about your mother and her influence religiously on you in these years. What was your father's role? How did he influence you religiously during middle and high school years?
So, in a direct way, not by much. And I don't want to say that he wasn't involved because he very much was. He was there. He participated in the men's chorus at church and things of that nature. My dad loved singing. We were a Christmas caroling family, and to this very day, my father passed away several years ago. Almost next month will be 10 years since my dad passed. I'm sorry, not 10 years, 20 years. 20 years, I'm sorry. And I, to this very day, remember his baritone singing We Three Kings while we were Christmas caroling. And after we left New York, Christmas caroling wasn't a thing in Virginia, really, but we would call people on the phone and carol. And so there was that. But one of the things to this very day that I always appreciate about my father was I count him as the person who bequeathed the curiosity that I carry with me, right? And so when I do my work in public theology and when I write the books and I encourage people to sit with the uncomfortable questions, a lot of that I got from my father, from a man who, because of his various religious traditions and upbringings and everything, and because of his work as an activist and somewhat of a radical and everything, uh, carried, I guess, what we now call a hermeneutic of suspicion. There's so many different things. And that's something that I carry with joy at this point because it makes me, I think, a really active reader and participant in the stories of faith. And so I don't know to what degree he introduced these things to me intentionally or to what degree I caught these things just by observing how he navigated the world. And he was a guy, like, one of the things he was religious about, even if it wasn't something he tied to his faith, he used to always carry this binder full of graphic paper. And he would draw stuff up on there and everything. And that's the type of curiosity that he brought to the world is something that I try to embody, not just with the world in general, but with my faith in particular.
Okay. Well, sounds like a wonderful man. How did he and your mother fit together religiously? Was it, you know, were there any tensions there because of his? I don't obviously know that much about him, but it sounds like he questioned a lot of things, was faithful in his way, went to church, etc. But had a lot of curiosity, different faith backgrounds, and she seemed to be very sort of um, straight, associated with her denomination, very strong in that. I'm not describing this very well, but you know what I mean? Did they get along
I definitely
religiously?
hear you. I never noticed any tension on that front. And I think some of it is because even though my mother was committed, my mother to this very day is also a curious woman. She's not closed minded in that way.
Okay.
And I thank both of my parents for that because I've never felt the need to be dogmatic in that way about, like, oh, we don't associate with XYZ. And so even as my mother was probably a little more focused faith wise than my father was, um, they both carried their beliefs with a level of humility that never felt intimidating to me.
Okay.
And I think that's probably a story that's more common than a lot of people recognize when we look at what we now call like interfaith marriages and things of that nature. Uh, There's a lot of people who maybe have one Jewish parent or one Catholic parent or one Buddhist parent and a lot of different things. And uh, I obviously didn't grow up in an interfaith household in that way, but when I'd imagine that the harmony that the parents were able to find despite the points of divergence and the stories that they held and revered is something that I can relate to based on how my parents were wired, you know?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So now let's leave your high school years and move into post high school. I don't know exactly what you did post high school. Tell us what you did there and what how religion what what the role of religion was in those years after high school, trade school or military or college, whatever you did.
Yeah, I went straight to college after high school and I was in, so I graduated from an Episcopal high school, which it wasn't like the people that were politically and socially conservative, but not so much theologically conservative.
Sure.
It was there, and to the point where I guess the tradition that I inherited was probably more theologically conservative, even as the people that I grew up with were more politically liberal. But I went to an aggressively secular college. And I don't mean that to be an insult. And it's all like I went to the University of Miami, who, to my knowledge, I believe had one of, if not the first endowed chair in atheism and secular humanism in the country, right? Like just to set the scene for what that looked like. And there was a large Jewish population at the school, like they have the Hillel Center and everything, and all that was cool. But I remember one of the stories that sticks with me hardest is there was one class where we were introducing ourselves on the first day of class, and oh, tell us a little bit about yourselves. And the first person who went says that, yeah, I grew up and I was raised Jewish, and I don't really identify with that anymore. And they included that tidbit, and everybody who went afterwards decided to share about their religious background as well. Like, it wasn't even in the prompt. I guess we just followed suit after that first person. And so everybody would talk about being raised Christian, and to a person in that classroom, 30 plus people, around 32 people in there, identified being raised in a religious setting of some sort and no longer believing or feeling belonging to those communities. And I was the only person who was like, yeah, I was raised. And even though I'm not currently attending or active in that community, because I wasn't going to church until I got to college, till I met this girl who made me. um, but everybody was like, yeah, I was raised this way. I don't participate there and I don't believe. And I was like, yeah, I was raised this way and I don't participate, but I still believe. And that was an interesting thing for me to do. And I now reflect back on that time and wrestle with the relation between and the distinctions between the idea of belief itself and the idea of belonging, and how these communities not only shape us, but the value that we place in these communities as we continue, like, what development looks like. And so by the time I got to college, if you asked me what I believed, I would have told you, yeah, I still rock with Jesus and all that stuff. But I wasn't really any different than any of those kids who, like, the way I lived. Like, no, we hung out together, we socialized together. That is where I found my belonging, even as our beliefs weren't aligned. And so there's a degree to which, if you were to look at me objectively and ask if I were religious, if you look at the sociological definition of religion, no, I wasn't really, like, all of the we celebrated Kwanzaa every single year when I was growing up. I wasn't lighting no candles. I wasn't inviting nobody to reflect on that stuff when I was in college. I wasn't attending any sort of
Right.
Bible studies or worship services or anything. It was in my head, right? Like, I wasn't really doing any of the things that I had inherited as I grew up. And so that was a time of, I guess, trying to define myself. And that's part of the reason I left home in the first place.
Yeah.
Is to do
So I
exactly that.
remember you said your mom one day asked you, "Do you want to go to church?" Uh, as you were leaving those last years in high school, went to college, had you stopped going to church already, or was that you went to college and all of a sudden you stopped going?
No, I'd stopped going while I was in high school, and
Okay.
it wasn't like a clean break. Like, oh, I'm not dealing with these people anymore. It's just like, oh, if I can sleep in on a Sunday, that's what I'm going to do. And that's how that started. So, like, it wasn't me disavowing any sort of belief. It was declining participation within the community. It had already started in high school, and by the time I got to college, and the community wasn't set for me, right? Because my mom picked the churches, and that's where I went. And those were my people. I got to college, and that wasn't really there for me. So there was no real need or pressure or even guilt about not going. It was just doing a whole different thing by that
Right.
point.
Right. And did your parents talk to you about your diminishing participation both while you were in high school and then whatever they knew about what you did in college? Was this a topic of conversation? Hey, Trey, you going to church? Or, hey, Trey, you're a senior in high school. Why aren't you going? Was that ever something that came up?
Never. I know it was easier when I was still at home in high school, for my mother to accept, because it's like I said, it's not as though I completely divorced the church. And so there were other things, like our church had a step team that I was still participating in. And
Right. Okay.
our church was actually close enough that, like, when I got to a certain age, she was fine with me riding my bike there. It's like maybe a couple of miles away. And so I would still come through and everything. People still knew who I was. And I think she was fine with that. Um, my father was well, I was 14 when he passed away. So for the majority of my high school, he was there for the first half of my freshman year of high school. Alive, rather. He lived in New York at the time. I was in Virginia, but he died pretty early on. And so pretty much all of my teenage years and college years, I was dealing with memories of my father.
Okay. Okay. That's right. And I think you said your parents separated. Is that right?
Yes. While
Okay.
I was in middle school. Yeah.
When you were in middle school. Okay. Um, okay. So what, when did, and I know religion is important to you today and a big part of your life.
Yeah.
What happened in college or post college that religion became more important, that you re-engaged, whatever the story was? Tell us that story.
Yes, I mentioned earlier that it was this girl who made me go to church. Not, she didn't make me. She, like my mother, did not grow up in church, but had a curiosity around it and knew that I had grown up in church. And we were dating at the time. We're now married. We've been married. It'll be 12 years next month. And
Congratulations.
thank you, appreciate it. She asked if I would accompany her to church, and so I did. And then she wanted to go back, so I made a habit of going with her. And then on Sundays, and she wanted to check out a Bible study in the middle of the week. And I remember going to those Bible studies and being impressed with the depth that the pastor there brought to the studies. And he always finished with a question and answer session. And we could literally ask anything about like the lesson that was taught that night, about any questions of faith that we had. And I was just so impressed because it was around that time. This is had to be 2021 at the time, uh, where I finally felt comfortable bringing all of the questions that I ever felt like I had to sit on to the table. And it impressed me so deeply that for the first time in a while, like I felt like I belonged there. Like, oh man, like we got to get back to Bible study. Like we got to get to church, whatever. And before I knew it, I felt myself for the first time in my adult life, like post adolescence, really, feeling like I was in the driver's seat when it came to matters of faith. Like this is what I'm doing, not because it's what my mother expects me to, but because this is where I want to be. This is where I feel as though I am being fed with regard to not only matters of faith, but matters of community and belonging. It wasn't just the lessons I was there for, it was the people that I got to sit with in conversation and things of that nature. And so, uh, and my story's not even really unique in that way. When I got to a place where I felt like my faith was my own, I felt more comfortable or excited about, I should say. I was never uncomfortable in church, but I was excited about community and belonging when I felt like, oh, I'm here because I want to be, not because I'm
Right.
expected to be.
Right. So did you have a lot of unanswered questions? You mentioned that you finally felt comfortable bringing all the questions you had to the table and getting answers. Was that something that you had, gathered over the years growing up? As I don't understand this about church or faith, I don't understand this, and you just sort of sat on them?
Yeah, most definitely. Whether we're talking about, and I didn't have the words for this stuff back then, but
Sure.
metaphysical questions, things about like whether or not the God we believe in is actually a material reality or things of that nature. Something I'd always wrestled with, particularly those came to a head when I was in college and sitting around a bunch of people who were like, "Yeah, I no longer believe anything." I'm like, "Wait, am I a weirdo if I do still believe some of these things?" Right?
Right.
And then even a lot of the stuff that we had carried around ethics when it came to matters of sexuality and what justice looks like and things like war and how are these reconcilable with the stories that we're carrying. So yeah, I had a whole lot of questions um, that a lot of traditions carry answers for, or at least justifications for. But a lot of those answers and justifications I found lacking. They sounded and felt canned to me, like really rehearsed. And I was like, have you really walked through the implications of what you're telling me right now when you're answering these questions I have? Or are we just repeating that which we've inherited without any real examination or critical analysis, right?
Right. Right. Okay. So what was the conclusion of that, or the result of that story of you began going to this Bible study with your girlfriend right at that time?
Yeah.
So what religiously happened from that?
Well, she for the first time she got baptized. I didn't feel the need to get baptized again. I was baptized when I was younger, but because I never really stepped away from my belief, even I stepped away from the community. I was cool with staying where I was, but
Right.
we started seeing increased involvement from both of us. I was helping out with like the teen ministry there because the guy who was leading that ended up moving away, and I tried to step in to fill a void. And that was actually like the start of this journey that's led me to where I am now, where I'm in full-time vocational ministry, right? I'm the pastor of one church and the executive pastor at another church. And all of this happened because of the formation that started when that lady asked me to go to church with her. Um, and a lot of that comes from the fact that I feel like I have at least something to offer to people who like me, right? Who I'm fine with believing in some of this stuff, but I have some questions and I don't feel safe bringing my questions everywhere. I recognize a difference between religion and theology. When we're talking religion, this is more of a sociological designation. We're talking about how communities and societies operate. We're talking theology. Now we're talking something different. That's a philosophical field. What is it that we actually believe about these things? What is the significance that we are ascribing in like a metaphysical level to some of these stories that we're carrying sociologically? And I'm equally fascinated by both of those things. And so, um, sometimes people ask me what I do. I joke, I'm like, I don't have a real job. I think and talk a lot. That's just what I do. And it's really cool because there's a degree. I did once have a real job. I worked in IT and human resources and a couple of other things, and those paid way better than what I do right now. But I rarely feel like I'm actually working now because I get to deal with people as they work out. Like, okay, to what degree am I a religious person, and to what degree am I fascinated by the things of faith? Because those aren't always the same thing. A lot of times, Christianity leads us to believe that those are one and the same, but they're not. In the same way that you can in reality be a Jewish atheist, right? Because when we talk about Judaism, that's not a religion that is marked by belief in the same way as Christianity. It's one that's marked by belonging. This is what we inherit. And you can be an observant Jewish person who doesn't really believe much about God in the way that we associate that in a Christian framework, right? And so wrestling with that tension helps, right? And that's why I get excited when I reflect on who my father was and his curiosity and everything, because he found belonging in a lot of places, but he was always wrestling with belief.
Right.
And I think that that's a lot of people, even as we struggle to name that.
Yeah. So you're a pastor. Tell our listeners where you're a pastor. That you said two different places.
Yes. I'm the pastor of the Intention Church, which is it's actually a new church plant which just launched this year. And it is a primarily online church. I say primarily because we encourage people to gather with friends and family. We observe communion every single Sunday. We're working towards regional gatherings and every now and then, but we're trying to acknowledge the reality of the way that not only technology in general, but the pandemic more recently in a tangible way have reshaped the way that we look at the world and connect in community and things of that nature. And people get to feel how they want about it. Oh, that's not a real church. Cool. You don't have to come. That's fine. Because I'm also still committed to the local church, and I'm the executive pastor at the Refuge Church here in Homestead, Florida. I do both of those things. I hold credentials in both of those places.
Okay.
But I determine what I now call denominationally promiscuous is how I roll.
Okay. Okay. Last question. Give us in a couple of sentences what religion has done to you, Trey Ferguson. Looking at your whole life, what has religion done to you?
Religion has given me the power of story, right? Because I fundamentally understand religion right now as a storytelling mechanism for societies, for cultures, for groups. Religion is how we communicate important things to each other through stories. And when I realized that, like, I recognize my life as a story that is still being written. And a lot of that is me growing comfortable with the idea of religion itself. And so when it comes to me at heart, even though I'm a pastor right now, I'm a creative. I'm a writer who preaches and a preacher who writes. And understanding religion for what it was, and not just Christianity, but we're talking like all, like even the ethno religions we don't even know names for apart from the people who practice them and everything. We're really just storytelling. And I am fascinated, as are, I believe, all people in societies. I am fascinated by stories. And so religion has allowed me to powerfully reclaim the power of imagination and storytelling.
Okay, well said. Thank you, Trey. So we have been talking with Trey Ferguson of Homestead, Florida, uh, today, and we thank him for his time. Thank you so much, Trey, for giving us your time and sharing how religion has shaped and influenced you in your life. It has been very wonderful and fascinating and enlightening for us.
Most definitely. Thank you so much for having me.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.